Okay, so it looks like we have a few folks on here who have used AP Insight resources either from last year or they started using them this year. Looks like the performance tasks get a lot of love because those are actually really user friendly for classroom exercises and review and things. You've had one or two folks using some of the assessments, and it looks like almost everyone is moving into derivatives, which makes a lot of sense. And looks like another person is into the area and volume, which is interesting. A lot of folks save that for the very end of the year, so it sounds like someone's sort of integrating that into what they're doing at this point. So I'm going to move the polls off of our screen so that we can begin the presentation. One second here. Okay. So welcome to this PLC, which stands for Professional Learning Community. We are going to be discussing this evening some tips for making the most out of AP Insight and integrating the AP Insight resources into your AP Calculus course. I'm going to move on to the introductions here. We already did the pre-meeting polls. And starting off with the agenda, so we did the pre-meeting polls to get a sense of who we have on the line. We're going to be walking you guys through just a few sections this evening. We're going to start with a brief recap of what AP Insight is and the types of tools that you're going to see there, which will just sort of serve as a reminder if it's been a while and you need just a quick refresher, or if a lot of these are still really new to you and you just need a sense of sort of like what types of expectations to have for the resources. We're going to have some time blocked off for our facilitators, Margarita and Kelly, to talk to us about their experience with AP Insight and some of the reflections that they've had. Excuse me. So I'll introduce them shortly. And we're going to leave some time in the latter portion for your questions and some open discussion that Margarita and Kelly can be responsive to. And for any point in the presentation, either during that question session or while Margarita and Kelly are sharing, or even if I'm sharing, feel free to enter any questions or like clarifications you would like into the chat box, and we can pause periodically and respond to those. And then we're going to wrap up with some related resources and next steps. So there may be some things that we're able to like sort of talk you through, like how to navigate to them on the AP Insight platform. But there are also a couple of follow-up steps that we want to make sure that we unpack for you guys before we leave for the evening. So that's our plan for the day, when we are intending to wrap up around 8 o'clock Eastern Time. So who we have on the line with us this evening are Margarita Morales. She is joining us from Dallas, Texas. She also happens to serve as our discussion board moderator on the AP Insight discussion platform. Margarita is not only an AP Calculus teacher herself, but she's also an AP Insight consultant, and so she's well-versed with training other AP Calculus teachers to use the platform and the resources. And she monitors the discussions online and also responds to a lot of those questions and follows up on inquiries. And then we're also joined by Kelly Orsi. She's from on the call from Illinois. Same situation with Kelly in that she's not only an AP Calculus teacher, and I think she put some of her info in the chat box there, but she's also an AP Insight consultant and offers trainings both through these like online platforms, but also has done like live sessions. And so they're both really valuable resources for us to have online today. I'm really excited to hear about some of their experiences and have them share with us. And so we'll get to that segment shortly. I'm just going to kick off with a quick recap of the AP Insight resources. So AP Insight was designed to be sort of a comprehensive platform that includes both instructional resources, things you can use to teach the content and skills, and also assessments for learning. So sort of checking in with where students are along the way as you're teaching the content and the skills. It's intended to provide focused support on specific challenge areas that are foundational to the college level achievement, but are yet hard to teach and hard for students to learn. And it uses formative assessments to identify students' misunderstandings during the instructional cycle so that targeted resources can be provided to help close those gaps. So just a couple things I want to call out here. In the first bullet, the idea of things being challenge areas sort of necessarily implies that the resources are not comprehensive. They don't address everything in the course. And so you're not going to find, for instance, resources on differential equations, because that's a pretty late learning objective, and it's the kind of thing that we would sort of put almost at like a level 4 or level 5 for a lot of students. And what we're talking about with AP Insight resources are things that are like trying to help the students that are at like the 1 or the 2 level get them to a 3 or a 4, at least for that particular topic, right? Not every student, is at a 1 or a 2 for every topic, but these challenge areas tend to be pitfalls for a lot of students. And so these 10 challenge areas have been sort of like called out, and there's a comprehensive set of resources for those areas, but it doesn't cover the entirety of the course. Another thing I want to call out in the second bullet here is that the formative assessments are targeting specific misunderstandings along the way. So they're not cumulative exams or assessments. They're not necessarily like going to all look and feel exactly like an AP exam item, because they are serving a different purpose. They're going to be at the level of AP Calculus, and the same, they're going to like scaffold and support students to get to the point of being successful on AP exam items, but they're not intended to mirror those perfectly, because they're intended to be formative, not summative. The AP exam itself is that summative, cumulative exam where really anything is fair game. But during the instructional cycle, while you still have the students, the idea is to help them and target those gaps where those misunderstandings lie. And the formative assessments have questions that are designed to do just that, almost with like pinpoint precision of like what is the one thing that the student might be confused on here. I'm not going to spend too much time on this graphic here, but it basically shows the model that the AP Insight platform follows. So for each of those 10 challenge areas, you'll see that there are resources that help you to prepare to teach something by like unpacking the types of things you're going to see in that challenge area. You have other resources that help you actually teach that content, things like performance tasks and other instructional resources. Then it's followed by an assessment category where that you have quizzes and other types of like open-ended free response things. And finally, there are also resources to help like act on those areas where students are still demonstrating gaps and misunderstandings, and those help you sort of bring everything full circle for students who still aren't quite getting it. And so there are a lot of very like comprehensive and robust resources on the platform. And what we're trying to do with these PLCs is provide support for teachers who are either sort of looking for ideas of where to get started or how to use them, or have particular like challenges in their own setting or in their own like classroom environment that they're curious about, sort of like tips and recommendations for like how to incorporate AP Insight into their teaching plan for the year. And so that's what we're going to spend our time talking about this evening. These are, by the way, just a list of like the actual resources that are downloadable. We'll probably spend a lot of time talking about the things like the performance tasks and the assessments, because those are like the most concrete and usable and everything. But one thing that this reminds me of is that we do want to emphasize that AP Insight is sometimes seen as something that's like, oh, like my administrator told, signed us up for this, and now we have to use it, and I already have a lot on my plate, and look at all this stuff. Look at look at all these extra things I have to use. Um, and so the first thing I want to mention in response to that type of concern is that first of all, like all of these are flexible and optional resources. So there's no like embedded requirement in the platform itself. And none of it is, monitored or anything. It's really pretty much there for your use. It's flexible. And there are a lot of ways that we've seen and heard about teachers using them in different ways. And then the second thing I wanted to add in response is that the AP Insight resources are not intended to be in addition to what you're teaching. They're actually intended to sort of to support what you already have to teach, essentially, to give you additional resources that you could swap out for other things you might have done. So it's really, it's completely aligned with the AP Calculus course and exam, and there's, not necessarily anything you'd have to do in addition. Sorry. So I just wanted to mention those things, that these are the things that you're basically already teaching. So here I'm going to transition over to Margarita and Kelly, who are going to share some of their own experiences and reflections having to do with the AP Insight tools and their use or ideas for how they might use them in certain scenarios, because they also, as I said, work with a lot of other teachers. So I'm going to let them share. I'm going to mute myself for a while, and then we'll wrap up towards the end with some of your questions and also like where you can find some of these resources.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Margarita Morales. I want to thank Tiffany for introducing me. And just like she said, we just want to get this PLC going by kind of just giving some honest reflections of our experience with AP Insight last year. And it seems like most of you have had some kind of experience with AP Insight, which is great because it should prove to have some good discussion for tonight. And I just kind of want to recount what I did last year with AP Insight. If you were a new teacher to it, then I was in the same shoes as you were. And just kind of to say to resonate with what Tiffany was saying is, I have all this material for AP Insight and I already have so much stuff to do. How am I going to implement this and use it to the best ability possible by actually implementing the formative assessment approach that AP Insight stands for? And so I kind of I was kind of lost at the beginning, just kind of where to start and what activities to pick, whether to do just, the challenge area assessments or the performance tasks, and whether to implement it in every single unit for the course. And so one of the things that I do want to say is that AP Insight is very flexible. And you can add it in as you go. You can pick certain parts of it. My challenge to you is to kind of definitely peruse it some more, research it a bit, and pick a unit that you think would be one that's more challenging for you, that you need a little bit of extra help in, and start planning through it all by using the prepare, teach, assess, and act model just for that one particular unit. Okay? And so this is kind of what I did. I went through one unit that I went through several units that I actually thought were a little bit challenging for me, that I knew the year before I had trouble with my students. And so I decided to pick specific things. Like, for example, one of the units that I felt that I had issues with was with integration in terms of using use substitution. And so for that one, I actually tried to go back and research all the performance tasks that were given for that unit in the platform. And one thing that I would say is that definitely go back and research the performance tests, because I know the performance tests tend to have several activities that are associated with it. And my issue was, well, do I need to implement these performance tests all throughout one class period, or do I split them up? And I can really say that it depends on which performance test, because some of them tend to go really fast and some of them can take a little bit of time. And so I had several different ways of how I use them. I researched them before, and I either used them as guided practice after I did my notes. Sometimes I used them as bell ringers, or sometimes I used them as exit tickets. Now, I did split them up. I don't think I ever did one full performance task in one sitting. Now, I have 45-minute class periods, so it was kind of hard for me to do that. If I was going to do a full performance task, it was going to take the whole time. So that's something that I decided to split it up. And so it would sometimes take me about a week or so I can get through all the activities in a performance task. Now, as I reflect over the performance task, one of the things that I really, really did like about them was the set of questions at the end of each performance task that kind of had a check your understanding box. And I really want to focus on that because that really goes back and hits on the misunderstanding that a student could have. And one of the ways that I would go back and implement it was to actually have some discussion with groups in my students. So when they would be doing the performance task, I'd go around, ask them the challenge area questions, not necessarily have them write it down because sometimes that was a little time consuming, but just kind of give me an oral reflection of hey, of what is that check your understanding actually asking you. And I felt like a lot of my students got like that aha moment when it came to those particular performance tasks. And so, like I said, that's kind of the way that I decided to implement it. I did the performance task, and then after I would finish all the performance tests for that particular unit, I went ahead and assigned the building block quiz after each performance task. And my building block quizzes, I would actually do them in class. I'd spend about 15 minutes doing them in class, so they'd all do it together. And then we would actually review the quiz in class together just to kind of see where we were at. And then the next day when they would come in, I would actually follow the next steps process for them. One of the things that I did once, I think, is I created a menu of the options that they have. And I see a question here from Glenn. It says, did I do them online? Yes, I did do them online. Okay, I set up my class online and I would just do them online, and I would feel more comfortable them doing it with me in class, just for sake of keeping them a little bit more accountable on what they were doing. Now, if you're more of a paper pencil person, then by all means you can also print them out, because I know cheating is always an issue, especially since they have the same 5 questions. So I guess I would do them online just for sake of taking a look and looking at the feedback from my students right away, by looking at the at a glance matrix that we have through the AP Insight platform. So after we would do a building block quiz, I would actually come back and spend about half a day, not a long time, but just on having them go back and review go back through the next steps process, which were the recommended resources that the building block quizzes usually gives to the students, depending on the questions that they miss. Now, for that, if the students, the way that I would grade them was, well, if they did well, I would give them a particular grade and, have them go back and just kind of reflect a little bit. But if they didn't do so well, I required for them to do the extra resources, and then I would give them back a certain amount of points toward their quiz grade. And so that's how I decided to implement my particular building block quizzes in general. And then one thing that I do want to highlight that I did use was the performance test before the challenge area. Let me see the question. Did you let them see the wrong answers right away or kept it secret until the next day? No, I let them see the wrong answers right away, just for sake of keeping track of the class, so that they can have some feedback right away. And it's just I did go off of my students' honesty policy there, just for sake of me trying to implement the class. Now, granted, I only had one AP Calculus class, so maybe with having two classes, maybe you might want to keep it secret and not do the reflection until the next day so that students are not sharing those answers. So that's just something that I had last year. Um, and just to kind of go back on the performance tasks, one of the type of performance tests that I would recommend is the performance test that's given right before you are ready to give a challenge area, the Ensure Challenge Area Understanding Performance Task, because that's kind of a nice review for everything with respect to that challenge area. So I'm not going to say that I did it for every single unit, but for particular units that I felt that needed more reinforcement, I would actually do it then. So from basically based off my reflection, I just want you guys to know that you could plan out a particular unit that you feel weak in, or that you feel you're going to need those extra resources for, and just plan for it. Just plan for that one unit. You don't have to add in all of your AP Insight material right away to every single unit. It's not a checklist of I have to hit challenge area 1, challenge area 2, challenge area 3. It's not. I don't want you guys to think that that's what AP Insight is set to do. Ideally, we would like you guys to use everything if possible. But I know sometimes it's a lot to handle, especially first year. And so we want to be able to implement the whole prepare, teach, assess, and act approach, but maybe just by pieces, or maybe in just the units you need, because as you guys have seen, the performance tests have activities, and some of the activities are great, but some of you guys might have better activities that you already use. And so you have to kind of pick and choose which activities you want to implement. Make sure that I challenge you guys to kind of implement the whole cycle of AP Insight for one particular unit, and rather than to kind of break into pieces, instead of just using, I'm just going to use building block quizzes, or I'm just going to use performance tasks. Kind of use the whole thing for just maybe a small unit. Okay? And I want you to know that you do have flexibility on how to implement it. Okay? And that's, I know that Kelly teaches BC Calculus course, so she might have a little bit of more insight on how she implemented her AP Insight. I know it was a little bit more selective for you, so can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, as Margarita just said, I've only taught the BC class, and so when I think about the topics that challenge my students, of course, I'm thinking things later in the year, like infinite series and Taylor polynomials and those kinds of things. But that's not something that's in the scope of the AP Insight program as of right now, just because the challenge areas are supposed to be foundational for success in a first-year college calculus course. But as I look at the challenge areas that they have outlined, there are definitely some topics that my students struggle with still, and that I could use the resources to help them along the way. For instance, I just gave a test today on related rates. And as I'm grading them and going through them this afternoon, there are still some of my students who are really struggling with that concept. I didn't do anything different that I've done in the previous years based on teaching related rates, but I'm planning on using some of the AP Insight materials in sort of the remediation process for them. Using some of the teaching materials before you get to the performance task to say, where are your misconceptions? Do you understand what these kinds of statements mean? Using the performance task to help them practice through, and then of course the building block quizzes as well. So I think that along the way, with the BC class, because the pace is so much quicker, and some of the kids don't necessarily catch on right away, that we can use it as far as looking back with remediation rather than along with the coursework itself. I also wanted to just comment again on what Margarita said about when you're trying to choose which challenge areas to focus on, if it's your first year through or your second year through. Some of the challenge areas like derivatives, or calculating or integration, they sort of span what I would consider multiple chapters in my syllabus, in my textbook. Our textbook doesn't have, for instance, like early transcendentals. They learn derivatives, and then they learn integration, and then there's a chapter on logarithms and exponentials and inverse trig functions. But the challenge area does sort of keep that all together. So it might be difficult to have that isolated in one particular unit. But there are some that you could just pick related rates or optimization or area and volume and kind of focus that just on one individual unit. And that might be a little bit easier to kind of ease your way into trying to integrate the program into your classroom when you know that there's essentially sort of a beginning and an end to the use of the materials versus we're starting this now and I'm not going to end it until January. So those are just some of the things that I wanted to add in there. And I will turn it back over to Margarita unless somebody has a question for me.
Okay, yes. And so I just wanted to focus on that today, just kind of open the chat and the questions for you guys to either share your experience on how you use it, because maybe you guys are using it in a different way and it's more effective to kind of ease us into AP Insight to help other teachers. So if you have any questions right now, we want to hear from you.
Yeah, and I'll just add while folks are thinking of questions, in response to what Glenn has put on here with the comment about like it would be nice to see Insight stuff added for BC. We hear that feedback a lot, so you're certainly not alone. And so, we know that it's not comprehensive for the things that students struggle with in that are unique to BC. So when they get to like series and everything, of course, there's just so many ways that students could struggle there, right? And so that is sort of like the long-term vision is to have resources that support BC as well. Sorry, the things that are uniquely BC. Excuse me. But in the meantime, what we do encourage you to do, as Kelly was mentioning in her discussion, is think about the things that students would struggle with that are within the scope of the AB topics, right? Because those are also relevant for BC, and the things that are going to have like long-term, lasting, like create lasting challenges for students if they don't understand them there, like things that will trip them up later. So anything, for instance, that has to do with notational expressions, when you're dealing with limits of Riemann sums and so on, like that's gonna just be revisited again down the road when they're doing other series topics. And so those might be some areas to focus on, like if you're just gonna have like somewhere to start, it's sort of project out like the places where you see students struggling eventually when they get to BC topics, and then working backwards to the relevant AB challenge areas that could help support them before they get there, so that maybe those things will be less of a challenge once they get to that point. And if you have, speaking of, Glenn's comment there about like maybe just one or two BC topics, please, either include that here in the chat box, or we have a feedback survey at the end. You could put it there as well if you think of something later. But if you have specific topics, like certain learning objectives or concepts that you find your students really struggling with that are BC unique, then please enter those here in the chat box or in the feedback survey, because that informs our work down the road of what types of resources we can develop for students and teachers. Lagrange. Yep.
Yes, Lagrange bound for sure. Just to kind of piggyback off of what Tiffany was just saying as well, identifying some of the topics that the AP Insight does cover that would carry over into BC. I know for sure looking at functions defined by integrals, that's something that my students continuously struggle with year to year. And then of course, when we get into, the topic of Taylor polynomials and then Taylor series representing functions and being able to identify and create a function that would represent the integral of a series, those kinds of things I think would be helpful to have a good, strong foundation and basis before trying to expect them to do things over their head with those things. Polar derivatives as well. Glenn, I totally agree with you there. It just, especially depending on what they've seen before with polar with the polar coordinate system, that can be a challenge for them as well. Margarita, do you have anything else that you wanted to add for questions?
And I am curious also if we have participants on the line who, it sounds like you guys have some experience using one or two types of the resources, and I'm curious if you have anything that you learned from that experience or something that you found that worked or didn't work that you're now making adjustments for. Like say if you had experience using AP Insight tools last year and now you're realizing like oh, like this is an adjustment I can make that would make it work more seamlessly for my classes. Like, you know, we're definitely curious to have you share here with the group what some of those adjustments were, or if you found just something that really worked well and that's something that you kind of want to give as a pro tip to other teachers who might just sort of be learning to navigate in that direction themselves. All of that is fair game as well.
I'm wondering, Glenn, if you're asking about viewing the quizzes themselves or the response data, the results. Okay. Well, that's kind of over my head of a question to ask, but I understand. Oh, I understand what you're saying now. If you're going to be doing it offline, so that would be a question that they would direct, not to the consultants. Margarita, I was wondering if you'd seen anything on the discussion board that people have asked or that people have mentioned that they'd shared with that you could maybe add to the conversation here.
I did just get a note from Margarita that her system froze, and so I think she's just trying to reconnect her audio. I really like that question, though. That might when we see her icon back on, then we might follow up with her. Glenn, your question about the viewing all the building block quizzes at once. I'm also curious for a little bit of clarification. Are you talking about the questions that are all in a particular challenge area? Say like, you know, all 4 of these like building block quizzes, I can look at them and they all have to do with, you know, related rates or something? Or are you talking about like, okay, great. I wasn't sure if you're talking about like just all questions ever. Okay. And one thing then I would also encourage you to do, I understand that you're talking mostly from the assessment perspective, and I think I can understand why that would be helpful. But and as a reminder, it's just sort of occurred to me while we were talking about that on the front end, when we were talking about that like plan stage of the resources, the plan stage, that there's a tab for each of the challenge areas where you can go to the planning resources, and those highlight. There's like a series of slides you can walk through that talk about like the particular misunderstandings that are going to be addressed, and then there are also some like planning resources that are PDFs and downloadable and everything that you can use as references. And the reason I bring those up is because, as Margarita was saying earlier, the challenge area resources are kind of like an end-to-end package, basically. Like if you're going to sort of pull anything out of AP Insight, you know, our strongest recommendation is to do it from like beginning to end for like a particular challenge area, not necessarily like, okay, I'm gonna do this one thing, this one like type of performance task, and I'm gonna do all the performance tasks for all of the challenge areas. I mean, that's great too, but you kind of don't see the progress that students make unless you start from the beginning of a particular topic of like, what is it that you can anticipate students are going to struggle with? And then here's how some resources to teach to those misunderstandings. And then here are some quiz questions to help target like which misunderstandings which students have. And then finally some like follow-up resources and reflection exercises to help students really like capture all of the experience of what they just like went through from a learning perspective. And so that like end-to-end process is really what like the platform was designed to do. And so so the idea, so when I say the planning resources are there, that almost might do some of the job when it comes to like, oh, what am I going to see on the assessments? You're going to see things that are related to the targeted misunderstandings. And those are all unpacked at the beginning during the planning stage as well. They're all meant to like, set you up for what you're about to teach, and then ultimately assess what you were teaching in a way that targets the same misunderstandings throughout. So you shouldn't really be seeing any surprises, I guess, when you get to the actual assessment questions for the whole challenge area, both by like building block and overall. So I just wanted to mention that.
I agree, and I think that one of those oh, sorry, go on.
Hi. Hello?
Hi, Margarita. Welcome back.
Hi, I'm back. I'm back.
No worries, that's fine.
Hi, yes. And I did hear your question on how to use the things that I saw on the discussion board. And mostly in the discussion board, I get a lot of questions just kind of on technicalities and on printing, how to print things out. But I have seen some good discussion on just how you can implement the different performance tests as different activities. And one thing that I tried to do with the discussion board is set it up by different performance tests, just so people can go back in there and add in different activities. And I've seen things from like them using it as bell ringers, like I said before, to some people creating menus, to kind of do different activities at the same time, and have them have students kind of rotate through the performance task activities. But if I know some of you guys have already used performance tests, because I think all of you guys have used AP Insight last year. So if you had a specific way that you used the performance test, or just used any part of AP Insight in general, if you would please go and post it to the discussion boards under the particular unit, we'd be really grateful, because we do want that feedback so that we can help other teachers as well. And I just kind of want to add in a little bit of extra information there as far as just kind of to go back to what Tiffany saying, kind of using the whole process approach. I want to focus on the ACT part, because I feel like sometimes we tend to leave that off. And so, and really we want to make sure that the students are getting that feedback, because it's not just about adding those extra activities. It's more about having them go back and figure out what they did wrong. You don't necessarily have to grade it. It's more kind of a discovery process for your students. And so I just kind of wanted to focus on that for a bit, because that really is what our idea of using AP Insight is for, is to make sure that we're getting those areas that they have those misconceptions in. So I don't know if Kelly has anything else to add as far as that is concerned.
Well, the one thing I was going to add was what I think is really important as far as some of those, not when you get to the ACT, but before that, using that student progress sheet, the one with the disagree and agree statements, just because that's where I think that you can eliminate some of those misconceptions right off the bat. Like I said, I'm planning on doing that with some of my students who didn't do so well on their related rates test, give them that misconception or that student progress sheet. Now I know that it's supposed to be sort of like a living document that works over the course of the entire challenge area. But now in retrospect, they can go and we can start having conversations about, I don't even know what this is saying, or, seeing what they agree or disagree with, and kind of, use that as a springboard.
Yep. I would actually use that student progress sheet at the end of a unit just to kind of do a check of how much they understood. And it's again, another reflection piece, just kind of for your sake and for your students' sake. Sometimes it's discovery for them as well. Like, hey, I didn't really understand what's going on there.
Well, I think it's also just to see if they understand the verbal descriptions of the mathematics. Right. And or the notational descriptions of the mathematics and, making those connections and putting them together.
Correct.
So, but you were going to talk about resources, Margarita, or?
Excuse me? Sorry.
Or were you going to talk more about those ACT resources?
Yeah, the ACT resources that I was using, like I said, one of the ways that I don't think I went in depth on one of them. One of the ways that I used it, as far as the ACT resources from the performance tasks and from the building block quizzes, was I created kind of like a menu for one of my students, or for my students in general, so that they could have different activities to do while they're in class, and it kind of takes care of your differentiation in your classroom. Kind of have a day where you have different activities going for different students at different levels, and you're kind of targeting all the things that your administrators are walking in and trying to look for, and you're implementing the program, and you're kind of targeting every single student for specifically what they need. And so and you're really just facilitating, just walking around and helping them in whatever it is that they may need help in. And so I thought that was a great way that you guys could perhaps implement maybe the ACT resources by creating menus. I don't know if you guys are familiar with what a menu is, where you kind of create different sets of activities for your students, and they walk through them. They get to choose what to do, and they can go through them in whatever order they want. And
I apologize.
I can upload it into the discussion board. And yep, I'll upload a copy of it. Or if not, I can probably send it to Tiffany, and maybe she can send it out. Yep. But I'll upload it into the discussion board. I think I should be able to. So that's one of the things that I did want to talk about there.
Okay, great. So we just have a few minutes left before 8 o'clock, and I wanted to make sure that we just have a chance to show you guys where you can find some of the things that we've talked about, or things that may help you navigate to places that may answer additional questions. Excuse me. So the first thing that I wanted to address, I'm very sorry, is that I mentioned early on that that the session we're doing right now is being recorded, and that these recordings get uploaded to the platform. So this will now join the existing webinar series of recordings that we did last year. So there were already 3 sessions that happened last year, and those may actually be really good resources to go back and listen to and watch if you haven't already, or if you didn't participate in them last year, because they actually walk through like concrete examples from specific challenge areas. So I know we did like one session with a focus on the derivatives challenge area. So that may be, a really hot topic right now, since it seemed like a lot of you guys were currently on or about to start the derivatives challenge area. And then there were other topics that we addressed as well. So I encourage you to check those out. Basically, if you go to the AP Insight platform, there is a tab that says Strategies. It's right there. There's the arrow. And then you want to navigate down to this little section of the menu under that heading, Integrate AP Insight. It will bring up the PLC webinar series, and this is where you can see like multiple recordings listed. So this one will be added to that menu, and you can see the topics there, things like using effective strategies and assigning quizzes, looking at the data from your students. So if you're really like at the point where you're actually like using the quizzes a lot, and you're like, but now what? And you're sort of wondering about like which ACT resources should I assign, and like how do I go about that? That may be a good session for you to listen to and watch. And so I just wanted to point you guys in that direction so that you can see both where this session will be posted and also where you can access other resources for those topics. And then the discussion board that Margarita was mentioning, and that Kelly was asking about posting to, is under the final tab in that menu that says Discussions, and we call it the Share What Works platform. It's just the online community where other teachers who are AP Insight Calculus users can post questions or share resources or ask for feedback or talk about tips. And so you'll see other topics of discussion that have already been posted there. You'll see Margarita's name there because she's the moderator of the discussion board. And so, check it out. We encourage you to see what's there, to post your ideas, and to, make that community your own. And so here we are on our last slide, but a couple of points I want to make on this slide here. This email address, apinsight@collegeboard.org, is also a direct link if you have things that are like tech support and questions about the platform itself. That's like a sort of a one-stop shop where those questions can go. If you have things that are like instructional, then we encourage you to use the discussion platform because then not only will Margarita see it, but other AP Insight Calculus teachers will see it as well. And then right below that, we have a note in red text here about the next PLC webinar in this series will be the evening of Thursday, November 16th, so mark your calendars. You'll probably get an additional, not probably, you will get additional communications about it, so check your inbox and so on. But I just wanted to give you guys a heads up so that you can save the date. And finally, our last step of the evening, we've left a couple of minutes for you guys to answer a few questions in our feedback survey. So I've just added the link in the group chat, so you can go to it directly. It should take about 2 or 3 minutes. Please leave additional comments as needed, but it's mostly just for us to get a sense of how helpful this session was for you and what other topics you'd like to see in future PLC discussions, because then we can use that to inform our planning and to really target what it is that you'd like to see more of. So Margarita and Kelly and I will stay on the line for until about 8 o'clock or so. If you have additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. Otherwise, if you just complete the survey, then that's it for the evening. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you again.
Thank you.